Hello, and welcome to Achieving and Celebrating Diversity. My name is Blair Craven, and I'll be your narrator throughout our discussion today. I'm a school law attorney with Karshevsky Bradshaw based in Nacogdoches, Texas. Today's training is provided to you by the Region 7 Education Service Center and the law firm of Karshevsky Bradshaw, LLP. Karshevsky Bradshaw is a school law firm based in Nacogdoches with additional offices in Houston and Beaumont. As one of the most diverse states in the country, Texas workplaces are often a melting pot of people from all races, religions, cultures, and backgrounds. Regardless of your personal background, it's inevitable that you will meet and work with others from various races, religions, and cultures during your employment with a public school district. Therefore, it's important that you understand the legal requirement that your workplace celebrate that diversity, as well as the overall benefits of working in an inclusive environment. As of 2016, Texas's total population was reported to be 27.86 million people. Approximate numbers from the 2010 U.S. Census show that approximately 45% of Texas is Caucasian, while about 37% is Hispanic. African Americans make up around 12% of the population, with Asian Americans and all other races making up the remaining 6%. Individuals of Hispanic backgrounds make up the fastest growing population in Texas. But keep in mind that diversity may look different in your area. For instance, think about the populations of El Paso ISD versus Houston ISD. What about a school district in rural East Texas? The minority populations that are prevalent in different areas of the state will have an impact on what a diverse workplace and school environment look like in your area. Since you work in a public school district, let's take a quick glance at what the numbers look like for students. During the 2016-17 school year, 5,359,127 students were enrolled in public schools. Hispanic students accounted for the largest percentage of total enrollment, about 52.4%, followed by Caucasian students, then African American, Asian, and multicultural students. Taking into account the diversity of Texas overall, as well as this diverse student population, it becomes clear that a solid understanding and appreciation for each other's differences is key to promoting a healthy and productive school environment. You may ask yourself, what's the purpose of this course? Well, this training will seek to answer 3 what questions. What? So what? And now what? We'll discuss what diversity is and its origins in the law. We'll then look at how diversity impacts the workplace and school environment. Finally, we'll look ahead to practical tips for achieving, promoting, and maintaining a diverse and inclusive environment in your workplace and classroom. So let's start with our first question. What? What do diversity and inclusion mean, and where can you find them in the law? Diversity and inclusion are not necessarily synonymous terms. Let's start with the dictionary definition of each. Diversity is defined as a noun, meaning the condition of having or being composed of different elements. The inclusion of different types of people, such as people of different races or cultures, in a group or organization. Inclusion, in contrast, is defined as a verb, meaning the act of including or the state of being included. This is more of an action term, whereas diversity is more of a state of being. You can be a diverse group without even trying. However, it takes action to create an inclusive environment. Think of diversity as an invitation to a table that has already been set. This table may have very different people sitting at it, but the table has already been prepared to accommodate all different guests. Inclusion, on the other hand, is like being asked to actually help the host set the table. Inclusion is the act of not just accommodating different groups, but actually involving those groups in the activities and decisions of the workplace. A good place to start when considering how diversity and inclusion play a role in the workplace is to begin with the legal framework at play. Many different laws apply to public school districts in their requirements to promote diversity and not discriminate against employees or potential employees on the basis of a protected characteristic. Federal law is the most important aspect of the legal framework regarding discrimination. The federal laws we will discuss apply to any public entity that receives federal funds. As a Texas school district, it's more likely than not that you receive some federal funds, whether from Title I programs or elsewhere. The most important piece of federal legislation for our discussion today is Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It's usually referred to generally as just Title VII. This law was enacted as part of the overall Civil Rights Act in 1964 and paved the way for future discrimination legislation. Title VII provides that it is unlawful for an employer to fail or refuse to hire or to discharge any individual or otherwise discriminate against any individual with respect to his compensation, terms, conditions, or privileges of employment because of such individual's race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Understand that employer is defined broadly by this statute. Employer means a person engaged in any industry affecting commerce, who has 15 or more employees for each working day in each of 20 or more calendar weeks in the current or preceding calendar year. This law encompasses almost every employer, except for very small businesses. Since your school district has more than 15 employees, your employer is subject to the requirements of Title VII. Another important federal law is the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, or ADEA. This law was not originally included in Title VII. Remember, Title VII only covers discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. The ADEA was passed shortly after Title VII in 1967. The Act protects applicants and employees who are 40 years or older and prohibits all forms of employment discrimination based on older age. The law applies to all state and local government employers, which includes your public school district. It also applies to private employers with 20 or more employees. Also notably absent from the original Title VII law was protection for disabled individuals. In 1990, Congress enacted the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. The ADA is a bit different from the prior federal laws we've just talked about because it prohibits discrimination against disabled individuals in all areas of public life. This includes disabled students in schools, public transportation, and public and private places that are open to the public. You've probably heard the term ADA compliant when talking about access to ramps or elevators in buildings. Of course, ADA also covers discrimination in employment matters as well. In regards to employment, the ADA requires that people with disabilities be given access to the same employment opportunities as those without disabilities. The law applies to employers with 15 or more employees. Employers must give reasonable accommodations to qualified individuals with a disability. Whether a person is disabled, as that word is intended by the Act, involves medical analysis and certification, as well as a dialogue between employer and employee as to what a reasonable accommodation will be in that workplace. Disability has a strict definition and does not include temporary ailments. It's also important to understand that the law doesn't require accommodations that pose an undue hardship for an employer to meet. For example, assume a blind employee of a smaller business requests that the employer purchase advanced software that translates all paperwork and emails to audio files. If the employer can show that the cost of this software is prohibitive and an undue hardship, the employer may be able to negotiate different accommodations that are less costly, but still allow the employee to perform his or her job. So, who enforces all of these laws? The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is a federal agency that oversees all federal laws that deal with discrimination in the workplace. The EEOC enforces the laws that we've just discussed, Title VII, the ADEA, and the ADA, as well as other federal laws prohibiting discrimination on the basis of pregnancy or genetic information. The actions that the EEOC will investigate include hiring, firing, promotions, and harassment, as well as wage and benefit issues. The EEOC's authority lies in its investigation of charges of discrimination against employers covered by these federal laws. The investigation process begins when an employee or applicant files a charge of discrimination with the EEOC. After filing the charge, the EEOC notifies the employer and requests a position statement. The employer submits this position statement detailing its version of the allegations, along with documents in support of its position. At this point, the EEOC reviews all information and fully investigates the charge. This sometimes includes interviews of the charging party or people working for the employer, or additional requests for documents or data. After the investigation is completed, the EEOC will take one of three actions. First, it could find no discrimination on the part of the employer. This finding accompanies what is referred to as a right to sue letter, which evidences an employee's exhaustion of administrative remedies and allows the employee to move forward with a lawsuit, assuming a plaintiff's attorney would take the case with a no-finding determination. Secondly, the EEOC could find evidence of discrimination by the employer. In such circumstances, the agency will attempt to negotiate a resolution with the employer on behalf of the victim. If resolution is unsuccessful, the agency itself can then sue the employer on behalf of the employee. Third, should no determination be made within 180 days, the employee could request a right to sue letter, and the agency is obligated to provide the employee with that right to sue without a determination by the EEOC. Just as a quick note, you should be aware that similar anti-discrimination statutes exist for students. They generally mirror the federal employment anti-discrimination laws that we've already talked about. First up, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits people from discrimination based on race, color, or national origin in programs or activities that receive federal financial assistance. Title VI is broader than Title VII because it covers all discrimination in any program receiving federal funds. This encompasses students who participate in a school's educational program that benefits from federal dollars. Title VI provides that no person in the United States shall, on the ground of race, color, or national origin, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. Next up, Title IX. You've probably heard of Title IX as it relates to athletic programs. Title IX is similar to Title VI in that it covers all programs receiving federal assistance. However, Title IX is limited to instances of discrimination on the basis of sex. Lastly, remember in our discussion of ADA, we said it was a broader statute than other anti-discrimination laws in that it wasn't limited to employment discrimination. Thus, ADA also covers discrimination against disabled students in education programs of state or local governments, including public schools. Some quick examples of discriminatory behavior by supervisory employees include failure to hire, failure to promote, denying raises or benefits, harassment of employees, demotions or reassignments, and firing. Employees without supervisory or management responsibilities are most likely to exhibit discrimination in the form of hostile environment harassment. This includes offensive jokes or comments, sexual harassment, taunting or teasing, and spreading misinformation. We now turn to our second question of the day. So what? We've learned what laws apply to diversity issues, but why do these laws even matter, and why should we follow them? Our first stop in answering the so what question is to understand that we all have unconscious biases that we bring to the workplace. So what is an unconscious bias? In general, bias is defined as a prejudice in favor of or against a thing, person, or group of people. Biases can be unconscious or conscious. A conscious bias is an explicit bias or preference that you're actively aware of. However, important for our discussion today, unconscious biases are social stereotypes about certain groups of people that individuals form outside their own conscious awareness. Everyone holds unconscious biases about various social and identity groups. These biases stem from every person's individual experiences and tendency to organize or categorize the world around them. Note that biases, whether conscious or unconscious, can include a prejudice against any characteristic of a person, such as race, age, gender identity or sexual orientation, religion, physical abilities, weight, and a multitude of other factors. Let's take just a few minutes to learn more about unconscious bias.
New research from the fields of neuroscience and social psychology has shed light onto the concept of unconscious bias. But what exactly is unconscious bias, and how does it affect our behaviors and decisions? Unconscious biases are simply our unintended people preferences. They are formed by our socialization, our personal experiences, and the representations of different groups in the media. These experiences act as social filters in which we make assessments and judgments of people around us. Research tells us that human beings have a natural tendency to place individuals into social categories. These categories are often based on visual cues such as gender, cultural background, age, height, or body size. We also categorize based on social background, job roles, religious identity, or political affiliation. The unconscious brain uses associations based on social categories to develop biases. For example, if we are constantly exposed to women as primary school teachers or receptionists, or men as plumbers and organizational leaders, these associations become wired within the human brain. The unconscious brain uses social categories to make unconscious judgments about people who are similar to us and people who are different from us. A common form of unconscious bias is affinity bias. This type of bias impacts talent processes in organizational decision-making, including how we recruit. Managers are more likely to hire people who look similar or with sounding names to them. Work allocation. Managers are more likely to assign key client projects to individuals within their teams who they have an unconscious affinity with. Performance. Where there is some kind of affinity, managers are more likely to spend time informally discussing positive contributions to the team and will focus on development and future work plans. For those where there is little affinity, managers are more likely to question past performance. The conversation will be less friendly and even hostile at times. Unconscious bias often results in a set of micro-behaviors. Examples of positive micro-behaviors include supporting the ideas of someone with who you have an unconscious affinity whilst in a team meeting, or simply wanting to have coffee with someone like you. Examples of negative micro-behaviors include checking emails on your phone whilst talking to a colleague, or cutting someone off in a meeting. Often our intention is not to make biased decisions, and through a focus on conscious thinking, and by creating inclusive work cultures, we can learn to control our unconscious judgments and mitigate the impact of bias on our talent programs.
Now that we know a bit more about unconscious bias, we can start thinking about our own biases and how to overcome them. Some common types of unconscious bias are listed here, and we'll go over them briefly. First, stereotype bias is the most common form of unconscious bias. This occurs when we internalize a social stereotype and actually let it affect our actions towards others. Society has formed negative stereotypes about almost every race over time. However, there's stereotypes about almost every group or characteristic. Take gender as an example. Would you be surprised if you learned that your campus nurse was a male? What if you learned that your school resource officer was female? Halo bias occurs when we see one great thing about a person, and we let that halo glow of the significant thing overshadow and affect our opinions of everything else about that person. For example, you look at a person's resume and see that they attended Harvard. You're instantly impressed. As you make your way down their resume, though, you see that they had a low GPA, never actually graduated, and have had a gap in employment of almost 3 years. It's common here for the glow of the achievement of getting into Harvard to overshadow the less impressive aspects of the person's resume. Horn's bias is the opposite of halo bias. This occurs when we see one bad thing about a person and let it cloud our opinions of their other attributes. Affinity bias is what was listed in the video. It's also called similarity bias and occurs when we meet someone that we have an affinity with, such as if you grew up in the same small town, went to the same college, or share the same hobby. When we find an affinity with someone, our unconscious bias kicks in, and we tend to gravitate towards the person and may automatically agree with their perspectives and opinions. Bandwagon bias is the epitome of your mom's old saying, "If everyone jumped off a bridge, would you do it?" This unconscious bias occurs as a result of a widely held belief or attitude within a group. Subconsciously, we tend to go along with the group's attitude, often ignoring our own beliefs. Finally, beauty bias is exactly what it sounds like. This bias has to do with actual physical attractiveness. Research shows that the more physically attractive we find a person, the more likely we are to assume that they are intelligent, successful, and likable. There are hundreds of different kinds of unconscious bias, stereotypes, and prejudices. These are just a few of the most common examples to shed light on biases that you may have without even realizing it. So we've talked about the legal issues related to diversity, and we now know that we all hold unconscious biases. But still, why does this matter? Your biases, stereotypes, and prejudices can overflow into your actions in the workplace and can have consequences for you personally and professionally, as well as consequences for your school district as a whole. Personally, your unconscious bias and subsequent actions can have a negative effect on your social interactions in the workplace. These biases can often result in grouping or cliques. We all know that we have our group of friends at work. This is inevitable. But is your involvement in a group preventing you from meeting or interacting with other employees? As educators, we can never underestimate the positive effect that interacting with those from different races, cultures, religions, and backgrounds can have on our ability to serve students. What if a student in your class was from Middle Eastern descent and is being ridiculed about terrorism from his classmates? While you may not identify with his struggle on a personal level, you may have a professional colleague in your district who's from a different culture. You may have a professional colleague in your district who is from this culture. Being friendly, inclusive, and open to this colleague's background may be a vital benefit to you as you attempt to resolve this issue and support the student involved. Don't be afraid to ask questions of your colleagues from other backgrounds. Approach the subject with vulnerability. You could even say, "I want to understand your background and culture better. Do you mind if I ask some questions?" Often individuals from minority cultures, religions, or backgrounds will be glad that you seek answers from them directly and are not relying on misinformation or stereotypes to inform your attitude towards their culture. Acting on your unconscious bias or stereotypes can also have professional consequences on your employment with the district. If you are exhibiting discrimination or harassing behavior toward a colleague, you may have a verbal or written complaint made against you by a colleague or parent, receive written reprimands from your supervisor, and see negative impacts on your professional evaluations. This type of behavior can also land you on administrative leave or suspension while the district investigates an allegation of discrimination. Serious discriminatory behavior can lead to termination or non-renewal of your employment and can even result in a personal lawsuit being filed against you for extremely serious behavior. Remember the Educators Code of Ethics, which applies to all certified educators in Texas, prohibits discrimination in Standard 2.5, which provides that educators shall not discriminate against or coerce a colleague on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin, age, gender, disability, family status, or sexual orientation. Violations of the Code of Ethics can lead to reprimands, good cause terminations, and non-renewals. They can also lead to sanctions being placed on your actual certificate by the State Board for Educator Certifications. When employees in a district workforce do not celebrate inclusion of all people, the district as a whole will suffer. First, education will suffer. When employees who are tasked with educating your district's children are exhibiting stereotypes or prejudice, students will either feel directly victimized or isolated, or may even begin to form their own unconscious bias from exposure to these attitudes. Secondly, productivity suffers. An example of this occurs when a district has tense racial relations within its staff. Administration will be inundated with complaints, EEOC charges, disciplinary actions for the perpetrators, and most importantly, the inability to work as a team can act as a significant deterrent to accomplishing campus and district goals. Discriminatory behavior by employees can also result in negative press or PR for the district. You've probably seen Facebook or other social media posts by employees or parents in your community blasting the district for a perceived slight. This kind of negative press contributes to a lack of employee and parent trust in the school system and can increase the number of complaints and grievances that your district must address. Lastly, employees who act on their biases and/or discriminate against others in the workplace will make the district vulnerable to EEOC charges and potential costly litigation. Attorney's fees cost valuable district resources paid for primarily by taxpayers. The more money spent on litigating instances of employee discrimination, the less money can go directly where it counts, in the classroom. Some other general impacts on the workplace that arise when unconscious bias is at play includes language barriers, a lack of open communication about different ideas, disrespect of colleagues, cliques and employee groups, which we briefly discussed, an overall lack of teamwork, resentment, and the tendency to jump to conclusions. Think of this example. If you have an unconscious horns bias towards a coworker, which we already talked about, you may be susceptible to misconstrue emails or innocent comments. Ultimately, a workplace that is filled with biased employees results in low employee morale and decreased involvement in the activities and success of the district as a whole. This brings us to our final question. Now what? As we move forward, we'll cover some practical tips to overcoming your unconscious bias and promoting, achieving, and celebrating diversity in your workplace. Remember our discussion of unconscious bias. Even these biases are formed in our subconscious, but that doesn't mean they have to stay there. Here are some proactive steps that you can take to overcome your own unconscious bias. First, use inclusive language. This is a good way to retrain your brain. For example, try to stop saying, "Hey guys," and use more inclusive language, such as, "Hey everyone." This may seem overly politically correct, but it's a good way to start training your brain towards inclusivity. Think of members of underrepresented groups that you admire and focus on them. This step is targeted specifically at stereotyping bias. When you consider individuals in a minority group that you look up to, your brain will automatically begin the process of breaking down this stereotype, meaning that your mind won't automatically think of the stereotypical characteristics when you see or meet someone in that group. You can think of people in the public sphere, like politicians that you agree with, athletic figures that you follow, or even celebrities. You can also think of people that you directly know, either in your personal life or at work, that are in an underrepresented group, but have characteristics, attitudes, and beliefs that you admire. Step outside your comfort zone. Force yourself to get to know someone of a different race, religion, political persuasion, or other background. Don't focus on similarities only. It can be so easy when we meet someone new to immediately begin the process of finding things that you have in common. This is a great social tool to form a bond with someone, but don't forget to learn about and celebrate your differences. When we find similarities in others, it's easy to group up with those people because it's comfortable and safe. When we actively try to discover differences with others, we slowly begin to learn more about our colleagues and the world around us, giving us a broader world view and making ourselves more open to those around us. Another proactive step is to understand that your unconscious bias is most likely to rear its ugly head when you are tired, stressed, or rushed. Our rational brain can sometimes be overshadowed in these instances. Try to make yourself more aware of times when you're under pressure and remind yourself that stress can bring your biases to the surface. Finally, counter-program your brain. All the tips we just talked about are ways to actively reprogram how you think. Remember, unconscious bias is formed in your subconscious, but it doesn't have to stay there. The more aware you are of your own biases, the more actively you can fight against them. So what are some specific areas in your workplace that you can work on overcoming your biases and be more inclusive to others? First, professional interactions is a common area where employees can feel excluded, isolated, or discriminated against. Be aware of your actions during staff meetings or staff development. Are you sticking solely to your group, or are you branching out to meet some new faces? In smaller departmental meetings, are you listening to and agreeing with the opinions of those who are similar to you? Or are you trying to pull out new ideas from everyone? What about written communication? With the prevalence of electronic communication in our lives, understand that emails and texts can so easily be misconstrued. While you are composing your next email, focus first on the substance that you want to convey, and then, before pressing send, consider the way that these words will be received by your audience. Your email could have innocent intentions, but perception is reality. Social communication is another area where employees often exhibit discriminatory behavior. Think of the metaphorical water cooler. These are the times during the day when you and your colleagues engage in personal interactions. You may discuss your families, current events, and politics, and often coworkers exchange humorous stories or jokes. These conversations are great opportunities to learn more about your coworkers, but can lead to hurtful comments as well. Just remember that not everyone has the same family ideals, political or religious persuasions, or attitudes about current events as you do. Similarly, not everyone has the same humor as you, so jokes about racial stereotypes, genders, or sexual issues can often offend or make other coworkers very uncomfortable. Be wary of these conversational topics. Finally, keep your biases in check when forced to confront a coworker with an issue. Conflicts are inevitable in a workplace, given the wide array of ideas and standards within its staff. Remember that unconscious bias rears its head when you're stressed, tired, or rushed. This includes anger and frustration. Focus on the substances of your conflict and stray away from personal attacks. In conclusion, remember that the law prohibits discrimination against others on the basis of a protected characteristic, such as race, age, gender, or disability, in addition to many others. These characteristics are often internalized by us in the form of unconscious bias. Everyone has these biases and everyone can overcome them. Acting on your stereotypes and bias in the workplace can have dire consequences on your personal relationships, your professional employment, and on your district as a whole. Remember, discriminatory actions are considered a violation of the Code of Ethics and can lead to non-renewal of your employment. Finally, comedian and talk show host Ellen DeGeneres finishes each of her shows with this simple quote to her audience. It may seem like an oversimplification of the issues we've discussed today, but ultimately, this is what it all boils down to. You've now completed this diversity training and are well on your way to being a more open, inclusive member of your district staff. We appreciate your attention during this important topic.